South Carolina, 1866. The war had ended, but nothing else truly had. The fields were still dry and tired, the fences still broken in places no one bothered to fix, and the people still lived as if tomorrow might take away whatever little they managed to hold on to today. Towns looked quieter now, not because peace had come, but because too many men had never returned. Those who did come back often carried something broken inside them, something that didn't heal with time. And in the middle of all this stood a man everyone knew. He owned land when most owned nothing. He had money when most had debt. He had influence when others barely had a voice. People called him respectable. They said he had survived the war because he was smart. They said he knew how to run things when others didn't. What they didn't say out loud was how afraid they were of him. His house sat just outside town, far enough that screams wouldn't travel, close enough that everyone knew who lived there. It wasn't a grand plantation the way it once might have been before the war, but it was still large by post-war standards. Whiteboards, a long porch, fields stretching out behind it, like the land itself had been claimed and broken into obedience. He employed women, poor women, widows, girls whose fathers had died in uniform or never come home at all. Women who had no land, no brothers, no money, and no place to go if they were turned away. He called it work. Most of the town called it charity. The women knew better. They came because hunger is louder than fear, because their children needed bread, because winter didn't care about dignity, because there were no good choices left, only choices that kept you alive another week. He made sure of that. The work was simple at first. Cleaning, cooking, washing, field. Labor, when the men were gone. Long days, sore backs, meals just enough to keep the body moving. He paid them late. Sometimes not at all. Sometimes in food instead of money. And when someone complained, he reminded them how easy it would be to find someone else. There was always someone else. What he wanted was never written down. It was never spoken directly. It lived in the pauses, in the way his eyes lingered, in the way his footsteps stopped too close behind them in narrow rooms, in the way doors closed when they should have been left open. He never forced himself violently, not in the way people imagined violence. There were no screams, no bruises that lasted long enough to show. He was careful, always careful. He offered protection, shelter, extra food, a warmer place to sleep, and he expected obedience in return. The women learned quickly what saying no would cost them. One of them had tried. She had arrived in the spring with 2 children and a cough that never quite left her chest. She lasted less than a month. One evening she raised her voice when he touched her arm. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just a flinch and a whispered refusal.
By morning, her things were outside the gate. By nightfall, she and her children were gone. No one asked where they went. No one wanted to know. After that, the others understood. Silence became part of the work. Lowered eyes, quick movements, obedience that didn't need to be spoken. He liked it that way. He told himself it was natural, that the world had always worked like this, that men with land and money made decisions, and those without them followed. He didn't think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as practical. If a woman benefited from his generosity, then surely he had the right to expect something in return. That was how he justified it, and for years, nothing challenged that belief. The town looked the other way, some out of fear, some out of convenience, some because they believed poor women had always lived this way, and always would. Even the church stayed quiet. A few sermons about kindness, about humility, about forgiveness. Nothing specific. Nothing that carried his name. And so the pattern continued. Women arrived thin and desperate. Women left quieter than when they came. Some stayed longer, hollow-eyed, moving through the house like ghosts. Others disappeared without explanation. He aged slowly in those years. His hair turned gray at the temples. His walk stiffened, but his confidence only grew stronger. Each year that passed, without consequence, convinced him that nothing ever would. He began to believe he was untouchable. Then 1866 came. It did not arrive with thunder or fire. It came the way most turning points do, quietly, almost unnoticed. That winter had been harder than most. Food was scarce, tempers were short. The town was tired of surviving. A young woman arrived just after the first frost. She was thinner than the others, her clothes worn to thread, her shoes split at the seams. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She simply asked if there was work. He looked at her the way he always did, weighed her usefulness, calculated what he could take. She was given a small room near the back of the house. At first she did exactly what was asked. Cleaned, cooked, worked the yard, said little, watched everything. She noticed things the others had learned to ignore. How certain doors were locked from the outside. How certain rooms had no windows. How the older women avoided eye contact. How no one ever stayed longer than necessary near him. She listened, and unlike the others, she remembered. Weeks passed, then months. When he finally made his expectations clear to her, she did not respond the way he was used to. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't freeze. She simply looked at him and said no. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was firm. The room went quiet, in a way that made his skin prickle. He stared at her, waiting for the fear to appear, waiting for her to back down. She didn't. That moment stayed with him longer than he liked to admit.
The next day she was given the hardest work. Less food, longer hours, the kind of punishment meant to break resolve without leaving marks. But something had shifted. She spoke to the others when he wasn't around, quietly, carefully, asking questions that hadn't been asked before. How long had they been there? What had he promised them? What had he taken? At first they resisted. Years of fear don't disappear overnight. But fear has a limit, and when enough of it piles up, it turns into something else. By spring, the silence in the house had changed. It wasn't obedient anymore. It was waiting. He noticed it, though he couldn't explain how. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room, the way eyes followed him longer than before, the way the women no longer shrank as quickly. He dismissed it as imagination. Men like him always do. What he didn't know was that words were already leaving the property, quietly, carried, by women who went to town for supplies, passed in low voices near church steps, shared between people who had nothing to lose. No accusations yet, no names spoken aloud, just stories lining up too neatly to ignore. By the time he sensed something was wrong, it was already too late, because 1866 was the year people stopped being afraid of him, and he had no idea how close he was to losing everything he believed he owned. By the time spring settled fully over South Carolina, the land looked peaceful again. Green returned to the fields. Birds came back to the trees. The dust softened beneath the rain. From a distance, everything appeared normal, almost hopeful. Inside the house, nothing felt that way. The women moved differently now. Their silence had weight to it. Where once there had been fear, there was now something quieter and more dangerous: awareness, memory, the kind of understanding that doesn't shout but waits. He noticed it most at meals. They used to eat quickly, eyes lowered, grateful for whatever was placed in front of them. Now they ate slower, not defiant, just unhurried, as if they were no longer afraid of being watched. It irritated him more than open resistance ever could have. He told himself it meant nothing. People grew restless in spring. Everyone did. He had seen it before. This would pass. But it didn't. The young woman who had arrived in winter remained unchanged. She did not soften, did not beg, did not look away when he spoke. She answered him plainly, without fear or warmth. He found himself thinking about her more than he wanted to. Not with desire, not exactly. With irritation. With unease. With the feeling that something about her presence disrupted the order he had carefully built. She had begun helping the others organize their work, quietly, efficiently. Meals were prepared faster, chores finished sooner. There was less chaos, less scrambling. It should have pleased him. Instead, it unsettled him. Control, he had learned, worked best when people were tired and divided, when they had no energy left to think beyond the next task. And now they did. One evening he called her into the main room. She stood where he told her to stand, hands folded, posture straight. He circled her slowly, the way he always did when asserting authority. "You're getting bold," he said. She met his eyes. "I'm doing my work." He stopped in front of her, waited for the familiar drop of her gaze. It didn't come. "You forget who you depend on," he said. "No," she replied. "I remember exactly." The room felt smaller then, warmer, like a storm pressing down on the roof before it breaks. He dismissed her with a sharp gesture, told himself he would deal with it later. But later never came the way he planned, because the town had started to change too. Men who had once tipped their hats to him now nodded stiffly instead. Shopkeepers took longer to serve him. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. A few people avoided his eyes altogether. He assumed it was envy or resentment. People always blamed men who survived when others did not. He didn't yet understand that stories were moving ahead of him. Not accusations, not yet, just questions. Why did so many women pass through his house? Why did none of them stay long? Why did they all leave thinner, quieter and older than they arrived? Questions spread faster than certainty ever could. And once they start, they don't stop. The church was the first place he felt it openly. He had donated generously for years, sat in the same pew, shaken the same hands. The preacher had once praised him for providing work when no one else would. That Sunday the sermon changed. It was still about sin, still about morality, but the words cut closer to the bone, about men who used their power for selfish gain, about those who mistook silence for consent, about the cost of taking what did not belong to you. No names were spoken, none were needed. He felt eyes on him as he sat there stiff-backed, hands clenched in his lap. For the first time in years, he felt something close to embarrassment. He left before the final hymn. That night he confronted one of the older women. She had been with him longer than the rest, long enough to know better than to argue, long enough to know what defiance cost. "Who's been talking?" he demanded. She said nothing at first. He repeated the question louder. Finally, she looked up at him. Her eyes were tired but clear. "People have eyes," she said. "They always have." The answer unsettled him more than any denial could have, because it meant the problem wasn't one person. It was time. From that point on, things unraveled quickly. A woman failed to show up for work one morning, then another. When he sent someone to town to look for them, they were gone. Not missing, gone by choice. Soon fewer people came seeking work at all. Those who did came with conditions, questions, expectations. He refused them all. Better to run things alone than surrender control. But isolation has a way of turning inward. The house grew quieter. Too quiet. He began to notice sounds at night. Footsteps where there should have been none. Doors he was sure he had locked standing slightly open. Whispers carried on the wind. Sleep became difficult. His dreams, once empty, filled with faces he could not name. He drank more. And with drink came carelessness. One evening, after too much whiskey, He spoke too freely in town, complained about ungrateful women, about how people didn't understand the order of things anymore, about how kindness was mistaken for weakness. The wrong ears heard him. By the next week, the sheriff had come by, not with a warrant, not with accusations, just questions, polite ones. How many women had worked for him? How long did they stay? Where did they go afterward? He answered calmly, confidently. He had nothing to hide, he said. Everything was legal, voluntary. The sheriff nodded, thanked him, and left. But the visit shook him, because the sheriff had not been alone. A man from the county office had stood a few steps behind him the entire time, silent, watching. That was when he realized something had changed. Before, power had moved in one direction. Now it circled. The woman who had arrived in winter was gone by then, left without asking, without warning. But her absence felt heavier than any presence. In her place remained something worse, memory. By late summer, the whispers had become statements. Quiet, careful ones, but firm. People spoke of patterns, of behavior, of years of silence. No charges yet, no public reckoning. Just the slow, inevitable turn of the tide. He began to understand too late what he had mistaken for safety. It wasn't loyalty. It was fear, and fear, once broken, never returns the same. He stood one evening on his porch, watching the sun dip below the trees, and felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Uncertainty. For the first time in his life, he could not tell which way things were going, and for the first time, he suspected they might not end in his favor. By the time summer reached its heaviest point, the air around his property had begun to feel wrong. Not hot, not uncomfortable, wrong. The kind of wrong that sat quietly in the chest, tightening slowly, making every breath feel watched. The cicadas screamed in the trees day and night, but even their noise felt unnatural now, as if they were warning rather than singing. He had lived on that land for years, long enough to know every sound it made, long enough to recognize the difference between wind moving through dry grass and footsteps cutting through it. Lately, the difference had become harder to tell. The women still worked. They rose before dawn, cooked, cleaned, carried water, tended to what little remained of the fields. On the surface, nothing had changed, but everything had. They spoke less when he was near, not out of fear but out of choice. Their movements were measured, controlled, almost deliberate. They were careful now in a way that felt intentional, not submissive. He noticed it most in their eyes. Before, their gazes dropped quickly. Now they held his for a second too long before looking away. Not in defiance, in assessment. That unsettled him more than open resistance ever could have. Fear, he understood. Fear was useful. This was something else. He told himself it was imagination. That age was making him sensitive, that the war had made everyone strange and suspicious. But the feeling followed him everywhere. When he ate alone at night, the house felt hollow. When he walked the halls, the floorboards creaked louder than they used to. When he slept, his dreams came heavy and restless. He began waking before dawn, heart pounding, unable to remember why. And then the women started leaving. Not all at once, not dramatically, one by one. The first left without a word. Her bed empty, her belongings gone. No note, no explanation. The second followed a week later, then another. At first, he assumed they had simply found work elsewhere. That was common enough, but something about the timing bothered him. They didn't leave after arguments. They didn't leave after punishment. They left quietly, as if planned, as if someone had told them it was time. When he rode into town to ask questions, the answers he received were vague. They moved on, found something better, didn't feel like staying. The way people said it made his skin crawl. Not defensive, not apologetic. Certain. That certainty was new. He began to notice how people looked at him in town, how conversations paused when he approached, how faces turned away a little too quickly, how shopkeepers answered politely but without warmth. The respect was gone, and something colder had taken its place. He tried to ignore it, tried to remind himself who he was, what he owned, what he had survived. But the ground beneath him felt less solid each day. One evening, after a long, silent supper, he walked the perimeter of his land alone. The sun was sinking low, staining the sky a deep red. The air buzzed with insects, thick and restless. He stopped near the far fence line, where the woods began to creep close. That was where the women often passed through when they left. He had always assumed they simply walked until they found somewhere else to go. Now he wondered who they met first. He stood there a long time, staring into the trees, listening. A sound reached him then. Not footsteps, not voices, laughter. Soft, brief, female. It came from somewhere beyond the fence. He felt his chest tighten. When he stepped forward, the sound stopped. The woods went still. That night, sleep refused to come. When it did, it brought dreams he hadn't had in years, faces he had forgotten, moments he had dismissed, words he had spoken and never thought about again. He woke drenched in sweat, the taste of iron in his mouth. The next morning, he found a folded piece of paper near the front of the house. No name, no seal, just writing. Neat, careful, a list. Names, dates, short descriptions written in a steady hand. Arrived hungry, left sick, cried every night. Never returned. His hands began to shake as he read. There were more names than he expected, more than he remembered, more than he wanted to believe. He burned the paper in the hearth, watching the edges curl and blacken. But even as the ash fell, he knew it didn't matter. The words were already alive. That day he lost his temper for the first time in years. He shouted at the women, accused them of theft, of laziness, of conspiring against him. His voice echoed through the house, sharp and ugly. They did not argue. They did not cry. They listened. And that somehow was worse. That night, 2 more left. The following day, the sheriff arrived. He did not come with anger or authority. He came with calm politeness, hat in hand, eyes steady. Just checking in, he said. Some questions came up. They sat at the table together. The questions were simple. How many women had worked for him over the years? How long did they usually stay? Where did they go afterward? He answered carefully. Truth mixed with omission, the way he always had. The sheriff listened without interrupting. When the questions were done, he nodded and stood. We may come back, he said. The words were neutral, but the meaning was not. After that, everything began to unravel faster. The church stopped inviting him to gatherings. The butcher stopped extending credit. Children stared at him openly in the street. And then the rumors stopped being whispers. He heard them clearly one afternoon, carried by the wind as he passed behind the general store. They say he kept them scared. They say he made them depend on him. They say it wasn't just work. He walked away before they saw him. That night he drank until his hands shook. The house felt different now. Not just empty, accusatory. Every room held memory. Every shadow felt heavy with things unsaid. He walked from space to space, touching furniture, walls, door frames, as if trying to convince himself it all still belonged to him. But ownership felt thinner than it once had. The women who remained moved with quiet purpose. They avoided him when they could. When they couldn't, They met his eyes without fear. That frightened him more than anger ever could have. One evening, as the sun set low and red, he found the young woman who had arrived in winter standing at the edge of the yard. She had not spoken to him in days. "Where are you going?" he asked. She turned slowly. "Somewhere you can't follow." He stepped closer. "You think you're free?" She studied him for a moment, then spoke quietly. "No, I think you're finished." The word struck him harder than any threat. She left that night, and with her went the last of his certainty. The days that followed blurred together. Letters arrived. Visits were scheduled. Names were mentioned he had hoped never to hear again. The town no longer hid its judgment. The silence he had relied on for so long had finally turned against him. And in that silence, something undeniable began to take shape. Not revenge, not justice, consequences. For the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to wait for something you could not control, to know that whatever was coming, you would not be able to stop it. He sat alone in his house one evening, the shadows stretching long across the floor, and realized the truth he had spent years avoiding. Power does not disappear all at once. It erodes, quietly, relentlessly, and when it finally collapses, it takes everything with it. By the time autumn settled over South Carolina, something had changed in the air that could not be blamed on the season alone. The heat had faded, the soil had cooled, and the trees had begun to thin, but none of that explained the weight that now seemed to follow him wherever he went. It was the kind of heaviness that did not come from exhaustion or illness, but from being watched, measured, and remembered. For the first time in years, he felt as though the world around him was no longer moving past him, but slowly turning to face him. He noticed it first in the smallest ways. When he walked into town, conversations paused just a fraction of a second too long. Not long enough to be rude, but long enough to be noticed. People who once nodded or tipped their hats now looked past him, or pretended to be occupied with something else. The shopkeeper who had once greeted him warmly now kept his replies short and his eyes low. Even the children who used to scatter at his presence now stared openly, their curiosity edged with something harder to name. At home, the silence had changed its shape. The house had always been quiet in the evenings, but now the quiet felt intentional, as if it were waiting for him. The room seemed larger, emptier, every footstep echoing longer than it should. The walls, once a sign of ownership and stability, now felt like witnesses. He began to find himself standing still for long moments, listening for sounds that never came, unsure of what he was listening for in the first place. He tried to reassure himself that this was nothing more than nerves. The war had left everyone unsettled. People were restless. They looked for someone to blame when life refused to return to what it once had been. He told himself that was all this was. A phase, a passing discomfort. But deep down, he knew better. The first official notice arrived on a cloudy morning, delivered by a boy who lingered at the edge of the yard, as if afraid to step closer. The paper was folded neatly, written in a careful hand, and stamped with the county seal. It was not an accusation, not yet. It was a request. Her request to appear at the county office for questioning regarding labor, practices, and employment conditions. He read it slowly once, then again, feeling the words settle into his chest like stones. The phrasing was polite, almost respectful, but beneath it lay something unmistakable: attention. For years, attention had been his ally. It had come in the form of respect, admiration, even quiet envy. Now it felt different. Now it felt like scrutiny. When the day came, he dressed carefully, choosing the same clothes he had worn to church for years. He wanted to look stable, respectable, untouched by rumor. As he rode into town, he kept his posture straight, his expression neutral, refusing to acknowledge the stares that followed him. Inside the county office, the air was stale and dim. A handful of men sat behind desks cluttered with papers. The sheriff stood near the wall, arms crossed, face unreadable. No one offered him a seat. He remained standing as the questions began. They were simple at first. How long had women worked on his property? How were they compensated? Were there records? Had any left suddenly or against their will? He answered calmly, choosing his words with care, offering just enough detail to sound cooperative without revealing more than necessary. But as the questioning continued, something became clear. They were not searching for answers. They were searching for patterns. Names were mentioned, dates repeated, descriptions overlapped in ways that made coincidence impossible to deny. Each time he answered, he could feel the space around him tightening, as if the room itself were leaning in. At one point, one of the men leaned forward and spoke quietly. "You understand, of course, that when stories match this closely, we have to take them seriously." He said nothing. The meeting ended without conclusion. No accusations were made, no charges filed. But as he stepped outside, the weight of what had just occurred settled fully into his body. This was no longer rumor, no longer whispers. It was becoming record. In the days that followed, the town seemed to shift even further away from him. People no longer pretended nothing was happening. The avoidance was open now, deliberate. He could feel it in the way doors closed, just ahead of him, in the way voices lowered when he passed, in the way even those who had once relied on him now kept their distance. He tried to maintain routine, but routine began to feel hollow. Meals tasted bland. Sleep came in short, broken stretches. When he closed his eyes, memories surfaced uninvited, faces, words, moments he had dismissed as insignificant at the time, now replaying with uncomfortable clarity. He began to understand something that unsettled him deeply. He had never truly considered how much the women had seen, how closely they had watched him, how carefully they had learned his habits, his moods, his weaknesses. He had assumed silence meant ignorance, obedience meant forgetfulness. He had been wrong. One afternoon, as he returned from town, he found a woman waiting near his gate. She stood straight, her hands folded calmly in front of her. He did not recognize her at first, but something about her expression made his chest tighten. She introduced herself quietly, said her sister had once worked for him, said she had not returned. There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, only steadiness. "I just want to know what happened to her," she said. He tried to answer, tried to explain, but the words came out thin and uncertain, even to his own ears. She listened without interruption, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, though nothing had been resolved. When she left, he stood alone for a long time, staring at the space where she had been. That encounter unsettled him more than the meeting at the county office ever had. Officials sought evidence. She had sought truth. That night he drank more than usual. The house felt oppressive, every shadow heavier than the last. He moved from room to room, unable to settle, his thoughts circling the same realization over and over again. He was losing control. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in pieces, small irreversible pieces. The church held another gathering a few days later. He was not invited. That alone told him everything he needed to know. When he passed by later that evening, he saw lights inside and heard voices, low, steady, serious. He did not need to hear the words to understand their purpose. Stories were being shared, and stories once shared could not be taken back. Soon after, the sheriff returned again. This time his tone had changed. There was no casual politeness now, No pretense of informal conversation. He spoke carefully, deliberately, informing him that a formal inquiry was underway and that further testimony might be required. The word inquiry echoed in his mind long after the man had left. Days blurred together after that. Letters arrived, requests for information, notices that demanded response. Each one tightened the knot in his chest a little more. He found himself staring at the walls, listening for sounds that weren't there, jumping at the smallest disturbances. The women who remained on the property moved carefully around him, speaking only when necessary. Their eyes no longer held fear. They held distance. And distance, he was learning, was far more dangerous. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the land stretched long shadows across the yard, he stood alone near the edge of his property. The fields lay quiet, the trees unmoving. For the first time, the land he had once believed he owned felt unfamiliar, almost hostile. It was then that the truth finally settled in, heavy and unavoidable. He had spent his life believing power meant control. Control over people, over silence, over consequences. He had believed that if he kept things quiet enough, long enough, they would disappear. But power, he was learning, only existed as long as others allowed it. And that permission had been withdrawn. The town no longer feared him. The women no longer stayed silent. The past no longer slept. As darkness fell, he remained standing there, alone with the realization that whatever came next would not be something he could negotiate, intimidate, or outwait. The reckoning he had avoided for so long was no longer approaching. It was already here. By the spring of 1866, the air around him had begun to change in ways he could no longer control. At first it was subtle, a pause that lingered too long when he entered a room, conversations that died mid-sentence, faces that turned away a little too quickly. These were small things, easy to dismiss if one wanted to, and for a time he did dismiss them. He told himself it was nothing more than post-war unease, people unsettled by change, by loss, by the collapse of the old order they had once relied upon. But deep down he felt it. Something had shifted. The town that had once bowed to his presence now regarded him with a different kind of attention. Not fear, not respect. Something colder. Something that watched rather than reacted. The kind of attention a man receives when others are no longer asking who he is, but what he has done. He noticed it most in the silences. At the market, vendors no longer greeted him with easy familiarity. Their hands moved more quickly, their words fewer. When he passed by groups of men, their conversations stopped altogether. The silence followed him like a shadow, stretching long after he was gone. He told himself it was coincidence. He told himself people were tired. But denial only worked when it was fed regularly. And lately reality had begun to starve it. The first real crack came when a former worker spoke. She had left his land years earlier, slipping away quietly in the night, taking nothing with her. At the time, he had barely noticed. Women came and went. That was the way of things. Poor women, especially, learned quickly not to linger where they were not wanted. But now she had returned, not to him but to the town. She spoke to a clerk at the county office, a man whose wife had once worked beside her in the fields. She did not accuse loudly. She did not cry or beg. She simply told what had happened in a flat, tired voice that carried the weight of memory rather than emotion. How she had been made dependent. How she had been threatened with eviction when she resisted. How silence had been expected, not asked for. The clerk listened. Then he wrote things down. And once words were written, they could not be taken back. Within days, another woman came forward, then another, each with a different story but the same shape. the same pattern of quiet pressure, the same understanding that refusal would cost them shelter, food, safety. None of them spoke of violence outright. They didn't need to. The picture formed on its own. He learned of this not through official channels, but through absence. A man who once greeted him warmly now barely nodded. A shopkeeper who once extended credit now insisted on payment up front. Small changes, yes, but together they formed a message too clear to ignore. Something was moving beneath the surface, and it was moving toward him. At home the house felt different. It was the same structure, the same furniture, the same wide halls that had once made him feel powerful and secure. Yet now every room seemed hollow, as if the walls themselves were listening. The women who still worked there moved quietly, efficiently, but without the tension he had once mistaken for obedience. There was no fear in their eyes anymore. No urgency to please. They did what was required and nothing more. That absence unsettled him more than resistance ever could have. One evening, as he sat alone in the dining room, he heard laughter outside. Real laughter. Not the careful kind he was used to hearing on his land, but something freer. It came from the edge of the property near the road. He stood and went to the window. Two women were walking past, one of them someone he recognized. She had worked for him once, years ago. She did not look at the house as she passed. She did not slow her steps. She did not lower her voice. For the first time, he realized something with a sudden hollow clarity. They were no longer afraid of him. That realization stayed with him long after the laughter faded. Sleep became difficult. When he did manage to rest, his dreams were crowded with faces he could not quite remember. Women standing in doorways, watching him, saying nothing, waiting. He began drinking more heavily, not out of indulgence, but out of desperation. The quiet inside his head had become unbearable. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. Every creak of the floorboards felt like accusation. And then came the visit. The sheriff arrived in the late afternoon, hat in hand, posture formal but not hostile. He did not sit until invited. He did not smile. They spoke politely at first, about the weather, about the harvest, about things that did not matter. Then the sheriff's tone shifted. He explained that several statements had been filed, that there were concerns about labor practices, that questions had been raised about coercion and treatment of workers. He chose his words carefully, but the meaning was unmistakable. "This is becoming something the county can't ignore," the sheriff said quietly. "Too many stories match up." The phrase struck him harder than any accusation could have. Match up. When the sheriff left, the house felt smaller, the walls closer, the air heavier. He sat alone for a long time, staring at the place where the man had stood, replaying every word. He had always believed his position protected him, that influence and wealth acted as shields, that people like him were beyond consequence. But now he understood the truth he had long refused to see. Power only lasted as long as people believed in it, and belief once lost did not return. The following days brought more signs. A notice appeared in town, vague but unmistakable. An investigation was underway. Names were not mentioned, but the implication was clear to everyone who read it. He stopped going out unless absolutely necessary. When he did, eyes followed him, some filled with anger, others with something worse, quiet judgment. He tried to assert control at home, to re-establish the authority that had once come so easily. But when he spoke, the words fell flat. They no longer carried weight. One evening, he confronted a woman who had worked for him the longest. "How you're forgetting your place," he said, the old edge returning to his voice. She looked at him calmly. "No," she replied, "you are." The words struck deeper than any insult, because they were true. He realized then that the world he had built was collapsing, not with noise, but with indifference. No one needed to shout him down. They simply had to stop believing in him. Days later, a letter arrived bearing an official seal. He did not open it immediately. He sat with it in his hands, feeling its weight, understanding what it represented. This was no rumor, no whisper, no misunderstanding. This was the beginning of the end. When he finally read it, his hands trembled despite his efforts to remain composed. A summons, an inquiry, a request for testimony. Not yet a charge, but close enough to make sleep impossible. That night, he sat by the window until dawn, watching the land he had once believed he owned. The fields were quiet, the sky pale. Birds moved freely where they wished, indifferent to his presence. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alone. Not powerful, not feared, not respected. Just a man sitting in the ruins of his own certainty. And somewhere deep inside him, a realization took root that he could no longer ignore. The story was no longer his to control. It was moving forward without him. And whatever came next would not be gentle. The notice spread faster than he expected. What had begun as murmurs now moved openly through the town. Carried not by rumor but by certainty, people no longer spoke in hypotheticals. They spoke as if the truth had already been decided, as if the outcome were inevitable. He felt it the moment he stepped outside. The street did not look different, yet everything had changed. Doors closed more quickly. Conversations stopped more abruptly. Even the air felt heavier, thick with something unspoken but fully understood. The inquiry was no longer private. By the time the county announced a formal hearing, the town had already passed its verdict. The notice was posted near the courthouse, written plainly without flourish or emotion. It did not name him directly, but no one needed it to. The description was enough. Wealth, influence, complaints spanning years, allegations of coercion, abuse of position, and exploitation of vulnerable women. The words sat on the page like a sentence already delivered. He stood before it longer than he should have, reading and rereading each line as though searching for a mistake. Around him, people slowed their steps, pretending to read something else while watching him from the corner of their eyes. He could feel their judgment pressing against his back. For the first time in his life, he wanted to disappear. At home, the silence had become unbearable. The house that once felt vast and commanding now felt hollow and exposed, every creak of wood sounding like accusation. He paced from room to room, unable to settle, unable to escape the growing awareness that the walls were closing in. The women who remained no longer avoided him. They did not need to. They spoke freely in his presence, no longer lowering their voices. They moved with a confidence that unsettled him deeply. He realized then that fear had been the foundation of everything he built. And now it was gone. The first witness was called the following week. He did not attend. He told himself it was beneath him, that the truth would assert itself without his involvement. But the truth, he soon learned, did not behave the way he expected. Word reached him quickly. She had spoken calmly, clearly, without anger. She described the way she had been brought to his property, the expectations placed on her, the subtle threats masked as generosity, the way leaving had never felt like an option. When asked why she had stayed so long, her answer was simple. Because I had nowhere else to go. The words traveled through the town like fire through dry grass. Another woman followed, then another. Each testimony added weight. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just consistent, painfully consistent. By the third account, denial was no longer possible. He began to feel the shift in the way people spoke about him. His name was no longer said with hesitation, but with certainty. The phrase "that man" replaced it in many conversations. as if his identity itself had become something shameful. Children were pulled away when he passed. Old friends stopped calling. Men who had once dined at his table now crossed the street to avoid him. The isolation was complete. He tried to remind himself of who he had been. A respected landowner, a man of means, someone whose word had carried weight. But those memories felt distant now, like scenes from a life that belonged to someone else. One evening he attempted to assert control. He called a meeting in the main room, ordering the remaining workers to gather. His voice was firm, rehearsed, carrying the authority he had relied on for decades. No one rushed to obey. They came slowly, reluctantly, their expressions unreadable. He spoke of loyalty, of misunderstandings, of how dangerous rumors could be. He reminded them of everything he had provided. When he finished, the room was silent. Then one woman spoke. "You didn't provide," she said quietly. "You took." The words landed with a force he had not expected. Another voice followed. "And now people know." He felt something inside him crack. He raised his voice, demanding respect, demanding order, demanding obedience. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. No one moved. No one bowed their head. No one looked afraid. They simply stood there watching him unravel. That night he drank until his hands shook. The bottle emptied faster than he realized, but the numbness never came. Only memories, faces, voices. He saw himself as others must have seen him. A man standing behind power, mistaking silence for consent, obedience for loyalty. The realization sickened him. Days later, a second notice arrived. This one more direct. A formal summons to appear before a county panel. There was no avoiding it now. The hearing was held in a modest building, but the room felt suffocating. People filled every seat, some out of curiosity, some out of anger, some out of long-suppressed vindication. When he entered, the murmurs began. He kept his eyes forward, jaw clenched, posture rigid. He told himself that dignity was all he had left. But dignity is difficult to maintain when the truth is spoken aloud. One by one, the testimonies were read. Each account stripped away another layer of the man he had pretended to be. The language was careful, legal, restrained, yet devastating in its precision. The room was silent as each story unfolded. When it was his turn to speak, he stood slowly. For a moment he said nothing. He looked out at the faces staring back at him. Some angry, some pitying, some simply tired. He opened his mouth, ready to defend himself, to explain, to rationalize. But no words came, because for the first time he understood something he had never allowed himself to see. There was no explanation that could undo what had been done. No justification that could erase years of control and exploitation. No authority left to shield him. He sat back down without speaking. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. When the hearing ended, no one approached him. No one spoke his name. He walked out alone, the sound of his footsteps echoing too loudly in the hall. Outside, the sky was grey, low, pressing down. He felt smaller than he ever had in his life. The power he had built over decades had dissolved in a matter of weeks. And as he made his slow way home, one truth settled in with terrifying clarity. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of his fall. By the time winter settled over South Carolina, the world had already moved on without him. There was no single moment when he realized it. No sharp event that marked the end. Instead, it happened the way erosion does, quietly, patiently, wearing something down until it could no longer pretend to be whole. Days passed without interruption. Nights followed without purpose. And slowly, the man who had once believed himself untouchable became invisible even to himself. The house felt different now. Not empty in the way an abandoned place feels, but hollow in a more unsettling sense, as though it had been drained of meaning. The walls still stood. The floors still creaked under his weight. The furniture remained where it had always been. Yet everything felt distant, disconnected, like a stage after the actors have left. He moved through it slowly, with the caution of someone who no longer trusted his own body. His steps were careful, deliberate. Each motion required effort. His hands trembled more than they used to. Sometimes he found himself stopping in the middle of a room, unsure why he had gone there in the first place. Silence followed him everywhere. There were no voices now, no footsteps beyond his own, no murmurs drifting in from the fields. Even the wind seemed to avoid the house, slipping past without sound. The stillness pressed in on him, heavy and unrelenting, forcing him to confront what he had spent his life avoiding: himself. He had once believed that power made a man solid, permanent. That authority gave weight to a life. But sitting alone in that decaying house, he began to understand how fragile it all had been, how easily it had slipped away the moment people stopped fearing him. The town had not punished him loudly. It had simply erased him. He no longer received letters. No visitors arrived. Even the merchants who once relied on his business had found other customers. His name, once spoken with caution or respect, no longer carried meaning. He was no longer useful, and so he was forgotten. At first he tried to cling to routine. He rose at the same hour each morning, ate the same sparse meals, sat in the same chair by the window. He told himself that discipline would keep him grounded. That order could replace the control he had lost. But routine without purpose is just waiting, and waiting, he discovered, was unbearable. He began to spend long hours staring out at the land. The fields had grown uneven without labor to tend them. Weeds crept through the soil. Fences leaned at odd angles, slowly surrendering to time. What had once been a symbol of his dominance now mirrored his decline. He told himself he did not care, but the truth was harder to face. He had built his identity on ownership, on control, on the belief that others existed to serve his needs. Without that structure, he felt weightless, unanchored, as though the world had quietly decided it no longer required his presence. At night, memories came uninvited, not the moments he would have chosen to remember, but the ones he had dismissed for years. A woman standing silently while he spoke, eyes fixed on the floor. Another hesitating before answering, as if weighing the cost of honesty. The way voices would falter when he entered a room. He had mistaken fear for respect, dependence for loyalty, silence for agreement. Now, with nothing left to distract him, those moments replayed endlessly in his mind. Not as accusations, but as reminders of truths he had refused to acknowledge. He saw himself more clearly than ever before. Not as the man he believed himself to be, but as the man others had endured. The realization brought no relief, only weight. As winter deepened, his health worsened. His body, long neglected, began to fail him in small but undeniable ways. His hands shook constantly now. His breath came shallow and uneven. Walking across a room left him exhausted. Still he refused help, not out of pride exactly, but because he knew none would come. He had spent his life believing himself necessary, indispensable, and now, faced with his own weakness, he understood how thoroughly he had been mistaken. The house grew colder with each passing day. He burned less wood, not from thrift but from fatigue. Some nights he sat wrapped in old coats, staring at the dying embers in the hearth, listening to the wind push against the walls. In those moments his thoughts grew darker, He wondered how many lives he had altered without ever noticing. How many people had carried scars because of him. How many moments of fear, of humiliation, of helplessness he had caused and then forgotten. He wondered if they ever thought of him now. The idea unsettled him, not because he feared their anger, but because he knew they no longer needed it. They had survived him, and that, more than anything, made him feel small. One evening, as the light faded from the sky, he found himself standing in the doorway of a room he had not entered in years. It had once been used by those who worked for him. Now it stood empty, stripped of everything but dust and shadows. He stepped inside slowly. The air was stale. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight. He stood there for a long time, staring at nothing in particular, as memories surfaced unbidden. He remembered the certainty with which he had once spoken, the confidence, the assurance that his will was law. He remembered how easy it had been to ignore discomfort when it belonged to someone else. And then finally he understood. His punishment had never been meant to come from outside. It was never going to be a courtroom or a sentence or a public reckoning. It was this: to live long enough to see himself clearly, to understand that everything he had built rested on the suffering of others, to realize that the power he valued most had left him empty. That knowledge settled over him like a weight he could not shake. The nights grew longer. His body weakened further. Some mornings he struggled to rise from his chair. Food lost its taste, time lost its shape. He stopped marking the days. Eventually, even the memories began to fade, replaced by a dull, constant ache that followed him everywhere. He no longer thought of redemption, or forgiveness, or legacy. Those concepts belonged to a different life. Now there was only endurance. On his final morning, the sky was pale and overcast. Light filtered weakly through the window, casting long shadows across the room. He sat where he always did, wrapped in layers, breathing shallowly. The house was completely silent. No footsteps, no voices, no signs of life beyond the walls. He stared ahead, his vision unfocused, his thoughts slow and heavy. And in that quiet, he finally understood the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Power had never protected him. It had only delayed the moment he would have to face himself. He had lived long enough to see what he was, and that, more than anything else, was his punishment. When he died, there was no sound to mark it. No one was there to notice. The town learned of it days later, through routine channels. A few names were written down. A property was catalogued. Papers were filed away. Life continued. The land was eventually sold. New people came. New stories replaced old ones. Children grew up never knowing the man who had once ruled that place with quiet cruelty. And so, in the end, that was how he was remembered. Not as a figure of power, not as a man of importance, but as a caution, a reminder that cruelty does not always end in chains or punishment. Sometimes it ends in silence, and sometimes the worst fate of all is not to be hated, but to be forgotten. If this story stayed with you, there are many more like it waiting here. Subscribe to hear them.